So welcome everybody to this first research seminar of 2025, a year that have started quite intensively. Whatever in the world, what's happening in the United States, I'm sure Tim is thinking about all the time. We're going to start in another end with Orri Stefánsson, who is a professor already of practical philosophy at Stockholm University, a Wallenberg Academy Fellow, and a former Pro Futura Fellow. One of the very few people that have both been Pro Futura and Wallenberg Fellow. I don't know how many there are, but not many. But most importantly, he is of course a researcher here at the Institute for Future Studies. And even more important, he used to be a postdoc in Paris in 2014, something I think like that, with me and Marc Flebet. And Orri has for a long time focused on how to handle situations of extreme uncertainty and how we should make rational decisions in those cases. You got your, maybe I mentioned already, your Ph.D. thesis from London School of Economics in 2014, and that thesis was also about decision theory and counterfactual evaluation. And then you've written a kind of vast number of papers in that area. With Bradley, with me actually, and other eminent people. And this paper is also co-author with Mac, who's sitting there, who has been skiing and therefore has a problem with his leg. Not good. Anyway, Orri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for being here. And yes, as Gustav mentioned, so this is a paper co-authored with Mac, who heroically came here despite having been, as I understood, brutally attacked by another skier in the ski slope. Yeah, I'll be doing the presentation, but I will direct any difficult questions to Mac, who will be in a better position to answer them, I hope. Another thing maybe I should say is that this is based on a paper that has grown quite long, and so I've of course shortened it a lot for this, and I may have left out some of the most philosophically juicy stuff, in which case I'm happy to, if you think that there's something, or the philosophers here might think that there's some philosophy missing that we should discuss in the Q&A.
What do you do if you're uncertain if you have left out something?
Then I'll leave it to you to decide. If there are any questions, then I'll become more certain that I left out something important, if there are any questions about that. Anyway, so this is a paper about solar geoengineering and some ethical and political issues connected with solar geoengineering. And, so what is geoengineering? Well, according to a influential definition, geoengineering means intentionally altering Earth's environment to abate anthropogenic climate change. Of course, we could imagine like geoengineering not to abate anthropogenic climate change, but this is how the term is typically used these days. And so solar geoengineering is a particular type of geoengineering where the idea is that we try to limit the amount of solar energy that enters the Earth's climate system, and thereby sort of reduce the temperature. And the typical way to do that, or not the typical, but the one that I'll be focusing on, and one that has been getting a lot of attention, the idea consists in injecting sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere. So they'll spread there and reflect back some of the inbound solar energy, thereby by cooling the planet without actually reducing the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. And by the way, solar geoengineering is sometimes also called solar radiation management, or SRM, a shortening that has become used quite a lot. And just because sometimes I couldn't quite fit solar geoengineering into the slides, I will be using SRM. And if you see SRM, I just mean solar geoengineering. So these are the same things.
But what does SRM stand for?
Solar radiation management. And so what we focus on in this paper is a recent argument that concludes that global justice demands solar geoengineering, and specifically solar geoengineering research and potential deployment if the research turns out a specific way. And so I'll call that, we call that the global justice argument for solar geoengineering. And so just to I'll just state the sort of basic premises of the argument first, and then I'll discuss that in detail. But one of the basic assumptions of the global justice argument is what we call the normative assumption, or you might think of this as a number of assumptions. And the sort of basic observation or assumption here is that climate change or anthropogenic climate change is an injustice, because those who are most harmed by climate change are the ones that are least responsible for climate change, right? Those vulnerable to climate change are typically not those who have those countries that have emitted the most. Poor countries are more vulnerable, less able to adapt, and so on, and they are not the big emitters. And so, because of that, there is plausibly some sort of obligation that those who are responsible for climate change try to rectify this injustice. So that's sort of the basics of the normative assumption that I'll spell out in more detail. And this, or something like this, is something that I think most people agree with, at least most sort of writers on climate ethics. Now, then there's the empirical assumption, which I'll also spell out in more detail, which is much more controversial, which basically says that solar geoengineering seems to be the best policy, or given our current evidence, solar and of all the feasible alternatives, solar geoengineering is the one that is best at reducing the climate harms for what we call the climate disadvantaged, and in particular, the currently climate disadvantaged. Something that I'll explain as we go along, why we focus on that at the moment. So that's the empirical assumption, which is very controversial, and but I'll explain why some people have accepted it, but more importantly, maybe I'll take it for granted because of it being something that some very influential climate scientists have suggested. But then I'll focus on whether actually it suffices for the global justice argument.
A question of clarification just about the normative assumption. Maybe you're going to get into that later, because I didn't understand the hence. The hence, those responsible for causes have an obligation. Why wouldn't somebody who's not responsible but have a lot of ability to rectify it?
They might also have.
Okay.
Yeah. It doesn't say that only those responsible, but those responsible or have a sort of special obligation because of their because of their responsibility for the
polluters pay or ability to pay and all that discussion.
Yeah. But here we focus on, and as I'll explain in a moment, here we sort of, following the argument that we're discussing, they just divide the world into two, those more and those less responsible, and so the able turned out to be the same as the responsible. Anyway, we'll get into that, which obviously is a huge simplifying assumption. Now, but anyway, based on this assumption and something else which is unclear, but we try to spell out, some climate scholars concluded that we, the rich, have an obligation to research and potentially deploy solar geoengineering for the sake of the climate disadvantage, those who are most affected by climate change and least responsible for its causes. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is to try to make sense of this global justice argument, in the sense that I'll sort of try to formulate a version that's both sort of plausible and also interesting. And I should say that those who have made this argument or some sort of hinted at this argument, they are scientists, and they, I won't debate them on the science, but they're not philosophers, but they're making here a philosophical argument, and so we try to make sense of it as a philosophical argument by adding the premises that are needed for its conclusion. And it turns out, we think, that the sort of the most plausible and interesting version of this argument actually fails, but a related but less interesting argument succeeds, as we'll explain. So even if the empirical assumption were true, remember the empirical assumption says that basically of all the feasible options, solar geoengineering is the one that's most best at reducing the harms and risks to climate disadvantage. Even if that's true, it still doesn't follow from the normative assumptions and what we think the proponents of the arguments are also assuming. It still doesn't follow that considerations of global justice demand solar radiation management or solar geoengineering. And so, this is maybe sort of the philosophically most juicy part, but and just in short, the reason why the argument fails is that solar radiation management is very imperfect as compensation for the injustices that the climate disadvantaged have suffered. So it doesn't, for instance, just give them new means to pursue their old ends and continue their practices. And therefore, we argue, based on sort of previous literature on similar cases, it requires some sort of hypothetical acceptance of solar radiation management as acceptable compensation. And by hypothetical acceptance, I mean, well, we get into this in more detail, but basically that they would accept it if they had sort of the relevant evidence and didn't make any reasoning errors, but still reasoned based on their sort of current values in addition to this evidence. And it turns out that we don't have this. We have the, in fact, explicit action of solar radiation management from the groups that are meant to be compensated. Okay, so 2 clarifications before I go into the argument. So first of all, I mean, we merely claim that this particular argument for solar geoengineering potential deployment and research, this argument fails. But we were not arguing against neither the research nor the deployment. We're trying to formulate this argument as plausible as possible, and then argue that it fails. And secondly, one thing that I should say, and this I think will become clear as we go along, but sort of the conclusion of the argument is research into solar geoengineering. But the reason why we're interested in this particular argument is that we're ultimately interested in the ethics of deployment. But as I think will become clear as we go along, this particular argument for research is sort of based on the potential value of deployment and its potential moral value, or its potential to sort of reduce the injustice of climate change. Okay, so by the way, I should say I'm perfectly happy with questions as we go along if anyone has any at least clarificatory questions.
It has stress on clarificatory questions and nothing else.
Yeah, completely damning criticism should wait until the end, ideally until after the talk. But okay, but unless there's a question, I'll just continue. Okay, so why is anthropogenic climate change considered an injustice? Well, I mean, maybe this is obvious to everyone, but I'll just state a nice quote to sort of illustrate this point. Not a very. I think it's already 13 years old, but it's so nice that I can't resist quoting it. This is from John Broome, where he says that of all nations of the world, Tuvalu is perhaps the most vulnerable to climate change. So Tuvalu is a Pacific island that is, because of sea level rises, will, according to some predictions, become uninhabitable within a few decades. And if these islands do become inhabitable, then the Tuvaluans will have to abandon their homes and their ways of life. Yet, the Tuvaluans have contributed virtually nothing to climate change. They live very simple lives and they use little energy. The threat of homelessness has been visited on them by the people of profligate nations, rich nations far away. In a moment, or later on, I'll take another example. But this is sort of it's this more or less general fact that those most vulnerable, those who suffer most and suffer first, are least responsible for the causes of climate change. And so to state this assumption, or to state the normative assumption, which is sort of based on observations like these, slightly more precisely, but still being, I think, faithful to what the proponents of this argument are assuming, we make this distinction between, on the one hand, the climate advantaged, and on the other hand, climate disadvantaged. Now, as I already mentioned, this is of course a huge simplification, and by the way, as will become apparent in a moment, this doesn't perfectly fit onto, for instance, national boundaries, right? There are people within nations that are amongst one group and some amongst the other.
It doesn't fit into the Nordic since we're going to get greater harvests for a long time.
Well, it does. Well, I mean, we are relatively responsible.
Yeah, but the agriculture is supposed to be.
All right, relying less on, yeah. Sorry, this I took away, I think, for sometimes because it didn't fit on slides, but often it's because of that, but not always. So like, yeah, in the Nordic case, we are relatively responsible, and it would be good for us, supposedly in the short run at least. But because of this, so yeah, I mean, this is not. It's not because of this in all cases, and I mean, in the case of the Tuvaluans, the reason why they are so extremely vulnerable is not because of the agriculture, but rather because it's an island nation that will, be more or less underwater soon. But anyway, the sort of general idea is that there is sort of one group that is more affluent and able to adapt, and is more responsible for climate change, and relatively invulnerable to its effects because of sort of how their economy works and so on. And then there are the climate disadvantaged, who are less affluent, generally less responsible, and more vulnerable. And as I said, this is of course a huge simplification, but I mean, I think it nevertheless serves a purpose. And in any way, sort of, this is our attempt to make slightly more precise what the proponents of this argument are suggesting. Okay, so then the one way to think of the injustice of anthropogenic climate change is that this group, the climate disadvantaged, they suffer most due to climate change, even though it's mostly caused by the activities of the climate advantaged. Okay, so the normative assumption, or at least one version of it that we think the proponents of the global justice argument have in mind. By the way, as I should say, maybe I should emphasize again that we are trying to reconstruct an argument that's sort of just quite sketchy in this literature. But anyway, we think they have in mind something like this, which we call the normative assumption. The climate advantaged have an obligation to rectify the injustices due to climate harms that current climate disadvantages suffer. So they need to somehow make up for the fact that they've imposed on harm on others that is unjust. Now, there's another version of this assumption that is importantly different and might be what they mean, although we don't think it is, and actually, well, it has some different implications, where the difference is just that this is a pointer. I'm not allowed to walk further than this, but I'll make an exception. So here the second version of it says that the obligation is to reduce the risks and harms, which might be possible without actually rectifying the past injustice. But anyway, we think that the proponents of the argument have this first assumption in mind, and we think that actually is plausible. We think, I mean, in general, when you have harmed someone in an unjust way, it's not enough just to make them better off in the future. Typically, we think that you should also make up for the fact that you somehow rectify the injustice that you made. And just to give, I mean, these are not the only ones, but these are maybe the most influential people who have endorsed something like this in an argument for solar geoengineering. David Keith in a paper with Joshua Horton. And David Keith, by the way, is maybe the most famous proponent of geoengineering in the world. Until recently, he ran something called the Solar Geoengineering Research Group or something like that at Harvard. Recently left for Chicago to set up something similar there. And anyway, they have they are amongst the sort of most prominent proponents of what we are calling the global justice argument. And we think that they're assuming something like this, although they don't quite spell it out like this. I mean, they don't really spell it out at all. Okay, so by the way, I should say here, note that this is all focused on the current climate disadvantage, those who are suffering now and let's say in the next few years. Now, this should not be read as saying that we don't have any obligations to the future climate disadvantaged. We also have obligations to them, and those obligations might require different policies than those whom are obligation to the current poor or disadvantaged demand. And in fact, that's probably the case. So even David Keith and Joshua Horton say that in our obligations towards the future climate disadvantaged require us to reduce emissions significantly, because that will hugely benefit. I mean, that will be required for the just survival of the future disadvantaged. But now we're just thinking of what should we do in light of our obligations towards the current current climate disadvantage. Then there might be some sort of trade-off between these, and so that's a sort of then a separate question. But now we're just focusing on what does our obligation towards the current climate disadvantage require. Yeah, Julia.
Just a clarification. Which of the two assumptions are you attributing to them?
So we think that they're making this assumption. But I'll come back to this assumption as well. But I think they're making this assumption. Yeah. But I mean, we can assume they presumably want both. But I mean, this is, as we'll explain, in some ways more demanding for reasons that will come clear. Okay, so that's then the normative assumption, and we'll just take that for granted, or some version of it. But the question remains: how should we satisfy it? How should we rectify the injustice? Or if we want to put it in terms of reducing harm, how should we reduce the harm? Right. So we will just follow the sort of literature that we're discussing by dividing climate policies into four categories. We know that these are not sort of very exact categories. They're we might have a discussion of how exactly or exactly where the border is and so on. But anyway, we just follow the literature here and divide climate policies into four categories: mitigation, adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and solar geoengineering. And by mitigation, we here mean, or the literature we're discussing here means something, means just sort of reducing emissions, which is not, sometimes carbon dioxide removal is thought of as an example of mitigation, because mitigation is then thought of as being the reduction of the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Right, and so according to some climate scholars, and for reasons that I'll explain on the next slide, solar geoengineering is the best of these to reduce the climate harms for the current climate disadvantaged. And so why do they say that? Well, first of all, they say that if you think of mitigation or the reduction in emissions, because of sort of how because of climate inertia and sort of how long emitted carbon stays in the atmosphere, even if we completely cut our emissions to zero today, it will not have any or almost no effect when it comes to the climate risks to the climate disadvantaged for decades. So we will not really, if we're just looking at this at the climate risks and climate harms to the current generations, mitigation won't really make any difference for good. However, it will be more expensive for the poor than the rich, because they, for instance, spend proportionally more on energy than the rich. So it will be hugely expensive for the poor. It will be expensive for everyone, but the burden will be greatest for the poor. whereas the benefits will not really be felt until many decades from now. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing to do, it just means that when we're thinking of the current disadvantage, it doesn't really help them. We should do it anyway, but not for their sake. And they argue, and I take their word for it, that the same is true of carbon capture, right? Because until we have reached today carbon capture has the same effect as reducing emissions, right? It just means that there'll be less concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. What about adaptation then? Well, adaptation is very costly, and probably too costly for most of those who need it. So it's too costly for the climate disadvantaged. We, the rich, could do it, but if we did, then the effects would be local. So we could do it for our sake, but if we do it for our sake, then the climate disadvantage won't be benefited. Now, of course, and this is something that we discussed in the paper, it's a bit weird to use this as the main argument against adaptation, given that you're trying to argue that we should do solar geoengineering for the sake of the poor, because one might ask, well, shouldn't we do adaptation for the sake of the poor? And I think what their response is that yes, we should, but we won't, unlike maybe solar geoengineering, where they say that, if we start with the final point, that is something that we, the climate advantage, could do, and if it is beneficial, then it will benefit the rest of the world, and proportionally it will have the greatest benefit for the climate disadvantaged, right? Those who are suffering most. So those who will be most badly affected by climate change, they will be most benefited by solar geoengineering. But because of the way that solar geoengineering work, maybe as they explain it, and I take their word for it, it doesn't matter really where these particles are emitted to the stratosphere. They just get distributed over the whole world, and they will have good and bad effects for the whole world if they have any effect. And we're pretty sure that they will have effects. So the effects will be on both those who do the experiments and on the rest of the world. In addition, the effects are apparently extremely sort of quick, at least compared to mitigation. If we were really to do this, it apparently would have almost immediate effects. And apparently it's apparently thought to be relatively cheap, at least compared to mitigation and even compared to adaptation. So it's sort of quick, cheap, and has a global effect. Sounds maybe a bit too good to be true, and of course there are enormous risks that I'm not going to focus on here. But this is sort of their this is a summary of what they say about these different policies. Any questions about that? Or actually, you shouldn't ask me questions about that, because I don't know the sciences. I'm just taking their word for it. But maybe if it's unclear, I can try to explain. But I can't justify this. This is just, we're taking their word for it. Okay, so because of this, the people to whom we are attributing this argument make an assumption that we call the empirical assumption, and we think that what they have in mind is the following, although they don't spell it quite out like this, that the existing evidence suggests that deploying solar geoengineering is the most effective and most feasible option to reduce harms to the current climate disadvantaged. It's important, of course, that it only suggests, right? And it's precisely because it only suggests that the conclusion is that we should do more research. If the assumption was that we know, or for sure, solar geoengineering is the most effective, then the conclusion would be, well, just go for it rather than research it. But anyway, we think this is the assumption that they are making. And as I said, there are some reasons, both sort of, including interesting philosophical reasons to be skeptical of this assumption. I won't go into detail about that, but anyway, I will just take this for granted for the sake of the argument, or sorry, we take this for granted for the sake of the argument. Okay, so these are the sort of two main assumptions, and the question is, how does that then translate into what we call the global justice argument? And here's a sketch, or here's an attempt, sorry. This slide will have a lot of text, but some of it will be a repetition from what you've seen. So first of all, we just have the normative assumption, which, just to remind you, says that the climate advantaged have an obligation to rectify the injustice due to the climate harms that the current climate disadvantaged suffer. Then there's the empirical assumption, which says that the existing evidence suggests that deploying solar geoengineering is the most effective and most feasible option to reduce climate harms to the current climate disadvantaged. Now, then we think there's some sort of conditional assumption being made, which is basically that says if you have these two assumptions, then from them to these two assumptions, it follows that the climate advantaged have an obligation to take the next necessary step, or the next necessary step towards morally defensible solar geoengineering deployment. So when you have this, then it doesn't follow that you should do solar geoengineering, but you should do the next thing that's sort of on the way towards solar geoengineering, assuming that it is as good as the existing evidence suggests, for the sort of from the global justice perspective. Now, and then there's the assumption that the next necessary step towards sort of morally defensible deployment is more research. And then the conclusion is that the climate advantaged have an obligation to conduct further research on solar geoengineering. And I mean, we won't get into that much here, but then there's sort of a corollary that if the research turns out to be in line with the existing evidence, then the obligation is to actually deploy. So something like this is, I think, what the argument that they are making. Yeah.
Just a quick clarification question. So the normative assumption refers to rectifying the injustices, and the empirical assumption refers to reducing the harms.
Yeah, exactly.
So you said you were going to focus on both rectification and reducing the harms. Is this a case where you meant to, I don't know, say rectify in the empirical assumption, or perhaps reduce the harms in the normative assumption?
Yeah, no, it was supposed to, and I mean that's part of the problem. So I mean the empirical assumption, it would be really weird if it says that we have it was an empirical assumption that geoengineering was the most effective, most feasible option to rectify the injustice, because the empirical assumption is just about the sort of well-being effects on the vulnerable or climate disadvantaged, and what's needed to rectify the injustice might not be fully captured by that, which is sort of part of the problem that we'll raise.
Oh, okay, all right. That's the problem then.
Yeah, I mean that is sort of part of the problem that this. But however, we do consider also the argument that replaces this with the sort of reduce the harm version, and it turns out we think that it has many of the same problems as the ones that we raised for this version of the argument, but it's still. I mean, we can go into, but in the paper we discuss both versions, but we think that they are making something like this argument, or trying to make this argument, which is sort of one of the reasons why it doesn't work. The other argument doesn't quite work either, but for slightly different reasons, which I think we can get into in a moment. How am I doing on time? Not very well, I think. Okay, so okay, well that should be enough. Okay, so basically we think that this sort of conditional assumption is false. It doesn't follow from these two assumptions that the climate advantaged have an obligation to take steps towards geoengineering deployment. And sort of here's a sketch of the argument, or the sort of explanation that I'll then go into detail about. So first of all, and we'll see some examples of this, but first of all, so we can't restore the situation that prevailed before the injustice. So for instance, and that's not the attempt. So for instance, the climate after geoengineering, solar geoengineering, even if sort of as successful as can be hoped, will be very, very different from the climate that was when the sort of injustice was happened, right? So it's not like we can just go back. The case is not like, you know, me stealing a bike and giving the same bike from Gustav and giving the same bike back to him. So it's not like we can literally sort of go back to the pre-injustice situation. Instead, we have to think of this as some sort of compensation. So we did something unjust. So for instance, in the case with a bike, we should think of this as analogous to me stealing Gustav's bike and destroying it, and unfortunately it happened to be the last bike in the world. So what should I do? Well, I can give him some cash or I don't know, something else as compensation for the harm that I did. And importantly, solar radiation management or solar geoengineering does not simply give those who are supposed to be compensated new means to pursuing the sort of their old ends or to continue with their sort of chosen practices. Instead, it requires them to engage in different practices and reprioritize their ends, which means that the best we can hope for is what Goodin called ends-displacing compensation, or sort of what we'll call sort of practice displacing compensation. So here I'm drawing on one of the papers by one of the long-standing visitors here to Institute, Robert Goodin. Bob Goodin. I guess Robert Goodin is his name. Anyway, but the important point about merely ends-displacing compensation or merely practice displacing compensation is that unlike sort of literal means replacing compensation, it requires requires some sort of acceptance, or at least it requires that those to be compensated don't reasonably reject the sort of new this prioritization that or reprioritization that we're basically forcing upon them. Okay, so I'll spell that out a bit, and by using a new example of climate disadvantage. And so consider the situation of the Sami people and other indigenous Arctic people, or the indigenous people of the Arctic. So here's another quote, again from Broom. It's very useful when giving talks like this, his book. Where he says that they, the indigenous people of the Arctic, have contributed virtually nothing to climate change, but they are amongst the first to suffer badly from its consequences. And well, I don't think I need to, I'm sure you've all sort of seen this on the news and so on. For instance, the Sami people, their reindeer herding practices are becoming increasingly more difficult because of climate change, and so that's an example of how they are amongst the first to suffer badly from the consequences, even though they've contributed virtually nothing to climate change. And of course, the same is true with the sort of indigenous people in Greenland and so on. And so the important point, if we focus on the Sami people, then it turns out that solar radiation management, it won't restore the loss of biodiversity in reindeer calving grounds, nor the local weather and precipitation patterns that are crucial for their practices. So it's not like this is going to, at best what this is going to do is it's going to sort of slow down the increase and maybe even stop the increase in the average temperature, but it won't sort of make up, it won't sort of turn the situation or the circumstances back into those that were before, when they could sort of much more easily engage in these practices of reindeer herding. So even if solar radiation management is in some sense better for current of Sami people than alternative policies, it won't make it possible for them to sort of engage in their cultural practices. It will sort of require them to shift to new practices. So at best what we have is what, paraphrasing a bit from Goodin, What at best we have is a practice displacing compensation, right? So it will be sort of possible to live there, but they will have to do something else. You know, it might be agriculture might be possible thanks to, or might be more efficient and more productive in there where they live thanks to solar radiation management, but they won't be able to engage in their current chosen practices. And so for that to be legitimate, again sort of following Goodin's suggestions, we need to assume that, or it has to be the case that the victims of the injustice, those who are meant to be compensated, that they do not sort of reasonably reject the compensation as acceptable compensation. So we don't think that we need sort of literal acceptance, but at least it has to be the case that we don't think that they do or would reject this compensation as compensation if they had the relevant evidence and so on. And now, unfortunately, for the proponents of the global justice argument, we actually do have pretty strong evidence that some of these groups, and here is just an example, I'll give you some others, that they do not consent to geoengineering in general, right? So that they just think that this is a terrible idea, which gives us very little reason to think that they would accept it as compensation. So, I mean, famously, the Sami Council wrote a letter that seems to have been sort of what actually sort of meant was the end for this Scopex project, which was basically a very small geoengineering experiment up in northern Sweden. So the idea there was to simply send up some balloons to test the sort of very first, or sort of the very basic requirements needed for an experiment like this to actually work. So they were just going to send up balloons and see if balloons like that could reduce the required particles at the required location up in the stratosphere. But the Sami Council wrote a letter which was very critical and of this technology and the research being suggested, where they said things like it's a technology that entails risks of catastrophic consequences. And so, we can discuss whether I'll discuss in a moment what that means for our assumptions, or should mean for our assumptions about regional rejectability. But first I should just say that, there is some evidence that the same is true of many other indigenous groups. There are others who have done sort of survey research and try to sort of find out what actually at least some of the climate disadvantaged think of geoengineering. But I should also say that I think that much more research is needed on what those who are meant to be compensated actually think of this potential compensation. So that's one of the sort of offshoots of this all is that whether the argument works depends on what those to be compensated think of this, and we actually don't have very much evidence of that. But at least we have some evidence that they don't consent to this and do not think that this is acceptable compensation. And by the way, one thing that's interesting to note, and this is maybe getting into some sort of philosophical details, but this particular rejection, for instance, is perfectly compatible with the Sami Council accepting the empirical assumption. So remember, the empirical assumption said that it seems, or the current evidence suggests that this is the best policy to reduce these types of harms. But of course, that's consistent with the technology also having extreme catastrophic risk, maybe small probabilities of these extreme catastrophes. But at least the evidence doesn't say that it will definitely be good. It's consistent with it possibly being terrible for some. So what this particular statement is, although I don't think that's true in fact, but this particular statement or the letter is consistent with them accepting, for instance, both the normative and the empirical assumption, but not agreeing to solar because of a different attitudes to risk, and in particular here catastrophic risk, than those who are in favor of the argument. So, at least currently, we think that this global justice argument is undermined by the fact that those who are meant to be compensated, according to the argument, seem to reasonably reject solar radiation management as acceptable compensation. But crucially, because solar radiation management would not simply provide new means to the victims to practice their sort of old and chosen ends, instead it requires them to sort of take up new ends, this sort of reasonable or the absence of reasonable rejectability is sort of key for its legitimacy. So, is there then any sort of closely related argument that would work? Well, sort of yes and no. So, consider this version of the conditional argument. Sorry, of the conditional that could figure in the argument. So, what this argument says is that when the normative and the empirical assumptions are satisfied, then the climate advantage have a prima facie obligation to take the necessary next steps towards morally defensible solar geoengineering deployment. Right. So they have a reason that could be a defeasible reason, but they have a reason to take the next necessary step. And I think this conditional is true. I mean, I'm not committed to that, but I think it's true. But of course, it doesn't support a very interesting conclusion, because for the argument then to be valid, we have to put this sort of prima facie into the conclusion, which would then, if one of the possible overriding consideration were lack of consent from those who are meant to be compensated, then the practical implications will be exactly the same. Namely that, yes, we do have a prima facie obligation to research geoengineering, but an overriding consideration is the fact that those who are meant to be compensated, they don't consent to the thing that is suggested as compensation. So the practical implication will be the same, even though we would then have both a valid and a sound argument. Yes, so, and of course, there is a very interesting argument that replaces the conditional with saying that we have the normative and the empirical assumption, and we have some sort of acceptance by those who are meant to be compensated. But then, of course, for the argument to be valid, we have to add as a premise that those who are meant to be compensated actually do accept this suggested compensation. But that, of course, we don't have. So then the conditional is true, and it would support an interesting argument. But the antecedent here is false, right? We don't have this acceptance, it seems. So for the argument to be valid, we would have to add a false premise. Okay, so let me just conclude then. So sort of to be a bit more positive and not too negative about researching solar geoengineering, I think there are many good reasons to conduct such research. Maybe it turns out that solar geoengineering is the sort of what's called the lesser evil, right? Maybe we will at some point find ourselves in a situation where the only choices we have are terrible climate catastrophes for everyone or solar geoengineering. So maybe it's good to be prepared for that sort of scenario. So that's a good reason to research solar geoengineering. It might even, because some people have worried about a situation where some nation or groups of nations unilaterally decide to deploy. That possibility is for various reasons, or could be a good reason to do research. Because maybe when we do the research, we find out that actually it's terrible for everyone, and so we will convince the rogue actors not to do it. So there is some value to that information, of course, because it might then prevent some solar geoengineering catastrophes. And of course, it might just be interesting in and of itself and generate a lot of knowledge about other things, about the climate systems in general, right? I think that scientists should be free to to pursue more or less whatever basic research, at least, that they find interesting, and it might generate a lot of knowledge that would be useful for other reasons. So the only thing that we have argued here is that despite these allegedly positive welfare effects for the disadvantaged, it doesn't follow that considerations of global justice demand solar geoengineering research, because we also need this sort of hypothetical, because it's meant to be compensation and it's imperfect compensation for the reasons that I've tried to explain. We also need some sort of hypothetical acceptance. Ideally, of course, actual acceptance by those who are meant to be compensated. All right, that's it. Yeah.
Very good. We're moving into the question and answer period. So put up your hand, and you are online. You can write in the chat, and please also tell your area of study, so we can take questions from different fields. And we can also have follow-up questions. Then you who are online write follow-up to the person you're following up to. And you here, you put up a finger. We're going to make a list because we have so many of these. Since I unfortunately have to leave early, I will start by asking a question. So
Oh no.
ask a question. There's two quick questions before we move on there. This is about consent. What are you going to do if some consent but not all? It seems to be a too strong requirement that everyone should consent, but that seemed to be something you didn't talk about. So
No,
it might
that's
be that some people. That's
yeah.
the first question.
Yeah.
Second question: where did this kind of non-identity problem disappear when it comes to responsibility? That a lot of the people, or to put it more generally, it doesn't need to be a non-identity problem, but a lot of the responsible people are dead,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
young people might not be responsible. That's two
Right.
quick questions.
Yeah.
before we move on.
Okay, so on the first question, I mean, that is something that we discussed in the paper. So, I mean, I think we should, at least there's no reason to not expect that if we did the proper empirical work, then it will turn out that some people think that it's a great idea, while others do not. And so the requirement is not meant to be that literally everyone consents. But then, of course, we do have to get into hard questions about what to do with compensation when one group thinks that's good compensation, but another group does not.
You also mentioned future generations. I wonder how you're going to get the consent from them.
Yes, but notice that fortunately we can forget about future generations for the sake of this argument, because the question is sort of, you start by looking at, is this acceptable compensation to those who are currently experiencing this harm? So this is just the sort of starting point of this argument. So we don't need of the future generation for in this step of the argument. Of course, if we then want to actually go forth with it, then it might be we might need to try to figure out what will this mean for future generations.
Let's say that the people here now, they don't consent, but we have good reason to believe that the future people would consent. What are you going to do then?
Yes. So actually, it looks like maybe that's an interesting philosophical thought exercise. But actually, most likely, it's the exactly the other way around, right? Because what's beneficial for the future, first and foremost, is that we reduce our emissions. The sort of distinctive thing about solar geoengineering is that it might benefit us, but it of course locks the future into a scenario where if we don't start emitting, then they will have to continue this project.
Sorry, because I don't understand. I'm a bit thick here. I thought that one idea of this was to give us some time to really get down the emissions, and therefore it will benefit future generations. But of course, we have to get down emissions.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't see any. Think about Trump. It
Yeah.
doesn't seem to happening now.
Yeah. So I mean. I think there's sort of the normative assumption. What do we do if the future generations think this is great, but the current generations don't think that's great? But then there's this sort of empirical observation that or prediction in particular, that since most likely it seems rational to not reduce emissions as much if we have this option, then some people worried that this is sort of would actually primarily benefit us at of the future generation. I mean, that's the whole sort of Stephen Gardner argument. But anyway, I mean, I think I don't know what to say about that part. But the first part, I think that yes, so that is a very important consideration, but it sort of goes beyond this particular argument. So because we're focusing on the current generation, what doesn't go beyond this particular argument, though, is the first part of the question, namely, what happens if there is disagreement amongst the current climate disadvantaged. And I think that, I mean, that's of course not something that's unique to this case here. I mean, when it comes to compensating big groups in general, of course, there's going to be some disagreement. But our sort of starting observation is just that, well, without knowing something about what people think, we can't even start doing the sort of trade-offs between when trying to figure out sort of what is the best thing to do given these disagreement. I mean, currently it looks like, of all the climate disadvantage that have been surveyed, it seems like everyone thinks this is a terrible idea. So we're not quite in this sort of conflict situation. But yeah, I mean, of course, for instance, the people of Tuvalu, it might be perfectly reasonable for them to say that yes, just geoengineer as much as possible, even though it's not reasonably accepted by, let's say, the Sami people. So yeah, I mean, we should expect that sort of situation, which is why we don't say that it has to be unanimous consent. There was another question too. I can't remember.
Maybe you should skip that. I just wanted the non-identity
or
the problem that a lot of people are actually not responsible there, even though they're living in this rich.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I think that's perfectly right, and I mean, I think that that is. I mean, complexities like these are sort of details about the normative assumption that are sort of important and interesting. Fortunately, I think that's not a problem for us because we're just sort of taking for granted that normative assumption. But I guess sort of for the sake of the argument to make some sense of it, I mean to the extent that you think that countries or nations can have responsibility that sort of is passed on to the next generations, even though those who committed the injustice are dead. I think if you accept that, which you seem to accept in many cases, I mean countries are making compensation for things done very long in the past. So if you accept that, then I think this should be fine.
I unfortunately have to leave, so I'm gonna leave it to Stina and Karim to file all the other questions. I'm very sad that I won't hear them.
It's a bit suspicious that you leave right after I unsuccessfully answer your questions. You're not leaving in protest.
There's no judgment on the talk or the answer. I have to meet the State Secretary of Finance to finance your research.
That's a good reason.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think next was Julia had a finger. Okay. Okay. So next on the list is Felicia. Just please use the microphone.
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting talk. I had a few questions, but I'll keep them short. So mainly I was wondering if you could expand a bit on how you kind of identify this global justice argument from the solar geoengineering researchers, or like what it's based on. Is it, their scientific articles? Is it, some kind of other like public statements,
right.
And what actors were involved in the kind of group that you assessed to come up with this argument? And then I was also wondering, I happen to have a friend that works for an NGO that is trying to kind of gather the input of the global South nations on what they think about solar geoengineering.
Right.
And especially like involving them in research on solar geoengineering. So I was wondering, and unfortunately I can't remember the name, but I was wondering if you've heard about it and what your take on it is, if you have. And yeah, I'll keep it at
Right.
that. Thank you.
Yeah. So just on the last one, I when I was thinking of preparing these slides, I was trying to remind myself that I should add that into the slides, because there is, I think what you're referring to is called, what's it called? It's, the name the name is
super obvious.
Yeah, exactly. The name is something like geoengineering, some initiative or something. But anyway, yeah, I know what you're referring to, and I think that's exactly the sort of input that we need if we are to make this argument. The degrees initiative,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So yeah, it's maybe they should rename or rebrand, but yeah. So first of all, I think that's great, but first of all, as far as I understood their project, they're not primarily interested in figuring out what does the global south think of solar engineering, but rather try to ensure that the models of the climate models that geoengineering is based or will be based on if it's tried, or that the researchers are using, to ensure that it's sort of sensitive to things that matter to the global south. And so, for instance, some of these models that we are using, or that we're referring to, or that the authors we are referring to, have been criticized for precisely leaving out things that matters hugely to the to the global south. But as far as I'm aware, then their primary interest is not to figure out what the global south thinks of this, but maybe they are, and then I think that's exactly the sort of thing that would be needed to sort of for this argument. But it's also needed for, I mean, if we at some point do decide to solar geoengineer, then of course, because it has these global effects, then the only chance it has of being in some sense legitimate from a moral or democratic point of view is to include these countries, of course. Yeah, and the first question, so I guess initially we were inspired by a paper by Horton and Keith called, what's it called? Do you remember that?
Climate engineering in the global poor.
Right. Yeah. And that's a chapter that they wrote for a book on, I think, sort of ethics of engineering or something, or climate engineering, something like that. So that's, I mean, it's sort of a philosophical paper, but or their sort of attempts at making a philosophical argument or a sort of normative argument. But David Keith, he's a climate scientist. Joshua Horton is a political scientist. But then there are another paper that we cite is by Svoboda and a string of collaborators whose names I can't remember. And that was and what they are doing, they are a group of, I mean, they are actually, at least some of them are philosophers, but some of them are climate scientists. And they come to sort of more or less, or at least for our purposes, the same conclusion as Horton and Keith, namely that, or I mean, they put it quietly, slightly weaker. They say something like, well, basically they say we have a amoral reason to do this research for the sake of the global poor. So we sort of we construct this or try to extract this argument from literature like this, and then of course, I mean, there are some sort of popular science books on solar geoengineering where the authors suggest something to this effect also. But I think your question was, did we get this from going around and interviewing the climate scientists? And the answer to that is
Like a big literature review, like if it was
no.
like this, as I understood, there are like key authors in the field.
Oh, I can repeat what.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, that was what I was wondering.
Right,
if it was
yeah.
so. It seems like it was more based on this kind of key author or like key researchers,
Yeah.
and not a group like a wider literature review?
No, because I mean, not as far as we know, at least. There haven't been much sort of written on specifically this. So yeah, it's just like a handful of occasional papers or chapters.
Okay, thanks. This is super interesting. I have a question about the alternatives. So you mentioned that they list these alternative policy options. But it seems to me that if they're right, then mitigation is neither compensating nor doing anything for the current generation.
Yeah.
And according to some studies, shutting down coal can actually increase warming over the short term because of the sulfur emissions from coal power stations. So mitigation can actually aggravate harm for for a 10-year period or something like that. And of course adaptation. I mean, one additional comment there could be that it's not only that it won't happen. Maybe it should happen, but it won't happen. But it's also possible that it can't happen. So relocating 10,000 people from Tuvalu is not that difficult.
Right.
But moving Jakarta, moving the population of California, etc. It's So maybe it's not just or required by justice to, but it seems like there are no better alternatives.
Yeah, so I mean that is an important consideration. I mean maybe, and I mean that is something that we do consider in the sort of end of the paper, that maybe this argument doesn't quite work. However, maybe I mean here's another conclusion. It's not that solar geoengineering sort of or global justice demands solar geoengineering. It demands something else, but given that something else is impossible, this is the second most just option. And I mean, we don't completely rule that out. That is possible. And of course, it is true that so, for instance, paying for adaptation for the, let's say, Sami people would have the same problem that we raise for geoengineering, right? So, maybe, they have to give up their reindeer herding, but we could sort of help them become, farmers or whatever. Some sort of adaptation. That, of course, has the exact same problem, namely that, it's a sort of practice displacing compensation. So we also need to ask them, well, are you happy with this alternative? So our sort of conclusion is just that, or our main conclusion is that we then have to actually do that sort of empirical research. We have to actually figure out whether they are happy with that sort of ends-displacing compensation. Maybe it's an odd thing for two philosophers to conclude that more empirical survey research is needed, but I think that is the conclusion there. That that might have the same problems. But at least what we have when it comes to the particular and practice displacing compensation that we were considering, we have explicit dissent. But yeah, I agree that maybe there is nothing we can do for some at least. Maybe there is nothing we can do for the Tuvaluans that is sort of perfectly just, given that, or if we can't. But now, of course, there is one hypothetical option that would maybe, or actually, no, that's not true. Forget that. Yeah.
Okay, next up is the man sitting behind Felicia. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Thank you. Very, very good presentation. Very clear. My name's Alan Atkinson. I was, until a month ago, in the practitioner world, you might say, rather than the research world, working at CETA for many years and then at a global organization on water. So and I've been following the geoengineering argument for at least 20 years, maybe longer. So I have two questions. I'm limiting myself to two questions. One's very informational. Is the global justice argument that you presented today, is it the preeminent argument now for motivating research in geoengineering? For the last slide that you had with the three other arguments strike me as much more compelling and have been compelling for decades. But is this where the dominant conversation is around the global justice argument, or are these other options equally placed in the current intellectual area? And then I have another question. I'll
so I can just quickly answer that. The answer to that is that, I mean, the global justice argument is not, I think, the sort of predominant argument. It has an interesting feature, namely that, you know, often solar geoengineering is criticized for being sort of you know, it's we in the West who are doing these models, and it's going to affect everyone, and it's not, you know, we don't have the right to impose this or change the climate for everyone else. So in that context, this is an interesting argument, because it says that, well, actually, I mean, it's for their sake. But nevertheless, I don't think it is the predominant argument, so no.
Okay. The second question had to do with the aspect of time. Adaptation was sort of, and I know purely for kind of intellectual reasons, dismissed quickly in the context of this. We can't afford this. In practice, of course, that's what the world is doing. It's investing billions in adaptation in various ways, and that investment was delayed because of the taboo around even talking about it 20 years ago. The moral hazard argument.
Yes, exactly.
You know, delayed investments in adaptation to the cost of human lives and lots of other things now.
Yeah.
So in these arguments around the global justice argument for geoengineering, what about the time dimension? What about the delay dimension? The longer we debate the question, the less we even invest in research, the less we even know about it. We don't even know whether the poorer nations want this or not yet. So we have projects just going on now, as I've just learned today. So is that time dimension even part of the conversation, the urgency, shall we say?
Right. So first of all, I just want to sort of echo what you said about adaptation, which it is fascinating that, as you said, I mean, I guess decades ago, or maybe even less, people didn't want to talk about adaptation because they said, well, if you start talking about adaptation, then we won't stop emitting. And of course now we just, I mean, you know, we can't not adapt. It's just, you know, this problem is here, we have to adapt to it. But now the same argument is being made against various sorts of geoengineering, not only solar geoengineering, but also, and so, who knows, maybe, I mean, in a few years, we'll find ourselves in the same situation with respect to geoengineering, and maybe even solar geoengineering that we found ourselves with respect to, find ourselves now with respect to adaptation. But more generally about the sort of urgency and timing, so there is one person who has written a lot about sort of the dangers that arise when people make these sort of it's so urgent, it's so dangerous, we have to act now arguments. So I think there are things to be said sort of on both sides, that yes, it is of course urgent and dangerous and we have to act now. But I mean, so the person I have in mind is Stephen Gardner, and but there are sort of reasons, sort of sociological and psychological reasons for being worried a bit about the sort of urgency arguments being misused as well. But I'm not sure if I have anything intelligent to say about the timing aspect, other than I think of course it is crucially important that, you know, and the sort of and the lesser evil argument that, you know, maybe we will find ourselves in a situation where geoengineering, it's with the choices between solar geoengineering and terrible catastrophes. In a way, the timing aspect, of course, plays in there because, you know, when we can't start researching sort of we can't start the research in earnest when we find ourselves in that situation. We have to have researched it before. So yeah, there are lots of reasons for thinking that whatever we think of geoengineering, how good or bad, no matter how bad we think the idea is, there's still a reason to do some of the research on it. So yeah.
I'll let the microphone go, but that's my main point too. Not to argue for deployment, but to argue for research, because then Elon Musk can afford to fund. He could do it individually.
Right.
Not even rogue nations, just rogue individuals these days could do it. Anyway, thanks for that.
Thanks. Yeah.
Next up is Ole.
Thank you. A few things I didn't understand. You said that one reason why mitigation doesn't work is that, in your view, mitigation is direct emissions reductions. And even if we stop emitting completely, there will be so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so climate change is inevitable. And then you said one reason why what you called carbon capture or carbon removal, sometimes people call it indirect mitigation, where we take out the carbon already emitted into the atmosphere from it. That it doesn't work is for a similar reason. I didn't get that, but we could just, because what I get is that it will take too long. So we won't be able to do that in time if we are thinking about people living now.
Right.
So therefore it seems that solar geoengineering is the way to go. And then you end up saying that we need more research due to the risks and so on that with solar geoengineering. And then it seems to me that this time factor comes in again, because now it seems that not even solar radiation management will do the trick either, because it won't happen that soon in order to save current people.
Right.
But then let's start with that.
But first of all, on the we're talking though about, or we might be talking about very different time scales, right? So the carbon that we have already emitted will stay in the atmosphere for 100 years and more. Research into solar geoengineering hopefully will have results not in 100 years, but in the next years.
But of course it will stay there only as long as we don't do anything in terms of capture or removal. But if we do that and have also reached a net zero, then things will change.
But the point is, that until we reach net zero, carbon capture has the same effects as mitigation, according to these climate scholars. Because what it does is it affects the amount of, or the concentration in the atmosphere. And by the way, just to clarify, I didn't say that mitigation didn't work. I just cited them as saying that it doesn't help the current generation of poor. It's still, of course, even the sort of the most hardline proponents of geoengineering says that we should do it anyway because for the sake of the future. But I guess the more important point for your question is that even though no one is suggesting that we do solar geoengineering now, but rather suggesting that we invest a lot of resources into researching it, their hope, I think, that the point at which we can deploy will be in the next few years, relatively soon. There are they already have some climate scientists say that they pretty much know what's going to happen with solar geoengineering, how it works and so on. Apparently one of the things that's lacking is airplanes that have the sort of exactly right characteristics to sort of release these things up there in the stratosphere. But anyway, the important point is that then once it is released, these particles, it will have very, I mean, not quite immediate, but the effect will be will come very soon. So even though in neither case are we talking about literally doing something today, the sort of time scale is still very different.
A short thing. Assume that researching solar radiation management would take time, as long time as would these capturing and removal and mitigation. But still, people, current people, would consent to it. Would that be relevant, given that it in fact would take as long as these other measures to deal with the issue? So the part where we say that sort of some sort of consent is required or acceptance is required is that if we are thinking of this as compensation for a past injustice we have inflicted on a group, then that particular group has to at least not outright reject that as compensation for the injustice that we inflicted on them. So yeah, hypothetically, if they say, well, we don't care about we just want things to be good for our grandchildren or something, and we think this would be good for our grandchildren, then I think, that would count as sort of them accepting this as compensation. Meaning that if they also accepted mitigation and removal, then that would...
exactly, yeah. In that case, that would, But notice that, I mean, when we were talking about the reasons why mitigation is set aside, we were not focusing on the reason that we then bring up to criticize the argument. We were just explaining why the proponents of the argument think that geoengineering is better than mitigation. But from the perspective of consent and sort of, I don't think that there is anything obvious to say, either way, in favor of one policy over the other, because we don't quite know.
Thanks.
Okay, next up is Julia.
Thanks. That was very interesting. I think I agree with the general conclusion that geoengineering doesn't seem to be a good form of compensation if we accept something like what Gooding calls this reasonable rejectability constraint. Although it might depend on how we understand it, as like Ole and you're talking about now. I was just wondering about a sort of a dialectical move that you made just before you started to develop the compensation argument, where you say that we cannot obviously restore the pre-injustice situation. The only thing we can do is compensate for it, and then you went on to argue against the compensation proposal too. So I was just wondering if this is the way that proponents actually frame or describe the justice argument, if that's what they actually say themselves. So if they talk about rectifying an injustice, this doesn't necessarily mean that they think that we need to restore the previous environment, right? So I'm not an expert on rectificatory justice, but I think that when people talk about restorative justice, what they have in mind is restoring a moral equilibrium, right? So it's not about... That doesn't imply that they need to restore the original good it used to be before the unjust practice took place. And so compensation is just one means of like restoring that moral equilibrium. Then you have apology, you have other ways of doing it. So I was just wondering, perhaps you don't need to say that for the argument, unless they themselves say that.
Right. No, I mean, they don't explicitly say that we can. I mean, they of course would agree with us that you can't literally restore the situation that was before. But I think the way that you put it is actually, I think, useful way of putting our point, which is that we want to restore. If this is an argument in restorative justice, then we want to reach some sort of new moral equilibrium, and our sort of one point is that, well, I mean, it's not like we can go back, so it's not like we can literally restore. But But then I think exactly the same sort of concerns come up that no matter if it's an apology or some sort of compensation, it still has to be sort of accepted or at least not reasonably rejected by those who are meant to be, those who are the victims of the injustice. Or maybe that was exactly what you were suggesting, that this is another way to sort of frame our argument. Yeah, but thanks. That is useful. Yeah.
Okay, next up is Joe.
I think there's a finger or. Yeah.
My question is actually on the same point in the talk. So I think that your answer partly addresses it, but I had the same feeling that you sort of present the options as restore to the pre-injustice situation or compensate. And that seemed to me just sort of slightly surprising, because it seemed like one of the things this is doing is pausing the development of future harms, removing some present harms. I mean, you acknowledge that in another place, but that seems like there could be a good reason to do it, right? So suppose I lay a bear trap and you step in it and now it's crushing your leg, and if I leave it, like, you'll lose the leg and I can release you from the trap and that'll undo some of the harm and prevent future harm. Thinking about this as a question of compensation seems kind of peculiar. I mean, you may want to reject that as compensation because it's not, and because that would maybe get you in a situation where you feel like you're precluding other real forms of compensation or restoration more broadly. But I think I should do it. And I'm not even, it's not clear to me that the same considerations about reasonable rejectability do apply, because those seem quite tied into these discussions of compensation, where compensation sort of completes a discussion because you have now been compensated. So you have to agree to it because, in part, I imagine, because it's about you and those ends and having to change what you're doing. But when you're stuck in the bear trap, I don't know that we should be having that conversation. We should just be stopping the harm.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree with all that, and I think it's sort of perfectly consistent with what we're saying, because we are not saying that there's no moral argument for, or there's no moral reason for solar geoengineering. It's just that if what the proponents are saying is that we have to somehow make up for our past unjust behavior, in addition to stop actually committing the harm. So I mean, in the bear, I think that in the sort of bear trap analogy, the analogous situation would be that, yes, I mean, so you should, of course, you should help me out of the trap, but presumably you should also then do something to make up for the fact that you, unless, you know, I was stupid and going somewhere where I shouldn't. But if you committed an injustice towards me, then in addition to help me remove the harm, you should also do something to make up for it, apology or ideally compensating somehow. I mean, that's the, I mean, when we go to people and make amends, we don't just say, I'm going to stop being an asshole now. We also presumably say, is there anything I can do to make up for the fact that I was an asshole? I think, not that I have ever had to do that, but yeah.
Valdemar, did you have a clarificatory question or finger on this? Can you take the microphone?
Thank you. Valdemar Ringdahl, Institute of Future Studies. Clarification about the term reasonable rejection in order to understand it better. What is the reasonable rejection?
Yeah, that's, I mean, unfortunately, I can't really answer that. But, I mean, there is this a large tradition in philosophy, sort of mostly tied to, philosophers like John Rawls and Scanlon, where they, in some cases, when we're trying to decide if something is justifiable, we need to figure out whether those who are affected, so if some action is justifiable, we need to figure out whether those who are affected by the action would sort of reject it, would sort of say that it's unacceptable if they were to sort of reason in a proper way and had the relevant information and so on, but still were the same people, right? So I guess the concrete way to think about in this case is that someone might reject geoengineering simply because they don't know what it is and think that it's scary. That wouldn't necessarily be reasonable rejection. Someone else might have sort of read up on the evidence, considered their own values, and sort of in light of these values and the available evidence, then decide that this is not a good idea. Someone else might have the same values about outcomes and read the same literature, but have a very different attitude to risk and say that, well, yeah, I see that it could be a bad idea, but I'm willing to take my chances. That would be a sort of reasonable acceptance, and so we can have reasonable rejection or acceptance of the same thing by different people based on different values and attitudes. But the sort of stress or the role of the reasonable there is just to emphasize that this is a sort of hypothetical sort of thought exercise. So assuming, do we think that they would accept it if they had the sort of the available evidence? And of course, the best evidence that they would not is if it turns out that they don't accept it, that they outright reject it, and moreover, we have no reason to think that they've made any sort of reasoning error, right? So if I want to, I don't know, I need your bike, and I sort of say that I'll bring it back tomorrow, and you just say no, and that I'm going to bring it back tomorrow, then I know that you in fact reject it, and so that's the strongest evidence that you also would reject it if you had all the evidence, even evidence that you might not say about exactly what time I will bring it back. So actual rejection, of course, is very strong evidence for this sort of reasonable rejection, in particular in cases where we don't have any reason to think that they've made any mistake or lack important information. Was that clarifying, or?
Well, it gave some of the background, and I understand the concept slightly better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Daniel, do you have a finger on this? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I think maybe you want to go further than that with the reasonable rejection. So let's say you slap me on the hand, and then you offer me $1 million, but I don't accept that as compensation. I want much, much more, right? And we have no reason to believe that I'm kind of making some mistake in my reasoning, or I'm too risk averse or something like that. It's just that's how I am, right?
Right.
It seems kind of unreasonable to be that way, right? And so I guess we want to idealize, but that's of course tricky how to do it.
Yeah.
But we want to idealize in some other way, even though you have it's not even hypothetical. It's just actually how I react, right?
But in that case, I would want to say that you are making a mistake in instrumental reasoning, because, assuming that 1 million. What was I? I was offering you, 1,000 kronor or whatever it was, and given the actual facts about how little you were harmed by me slapping you on the hand, and given the actual facts about how, well, let's make it into 100,000, how much you could do with 100,000, it would, just based on your values, be a mistake to.
But I'm just interested in your downfall.
Okay, but then it's
because of your slapping my hand.
Yeah. But then of course we have to discuss, what are reasonable values and preferences and so on. But
that was my point.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next up is Emma.
I don't know if this is out of scope, but your argument seems to rely a lot on this rejection of compensation, right? Like they reject it, and then there are a bunch of people who are in the business of changing people's opinions and And is that okay then to do a lot of research on, the greatness of solar engineering, or showing how safe it is, or research on risk attitudes, or changing people's risk attitudes? Is that okay, or does it follow that it's not?
Yeah, interesting. So, I think that there's a sort of a general question of like when are nudges and so on that change people's attitudes. When are they okay? And I don't think I have anything sort of new to say about that. But in this particular context, I would say that at least, so one of the things you said is, well, provide more information. And I think that, you can, if you can change people's attitudes by providing correct information, then I think that's perfectly fine. Then, of course, I could provide correct information and you could provide correct information, but it's just we're both presenting a sort of limited part of the total information, and it might have different effects on different people. So it's, we might have to look more at specific cases, but in general, I think that, there are some instances where you change someone's opinions and make them accept something that are perfectly fine. There are some cases that are clearly not fine because you're misleading or lying or deceiving. And then, of course, there's a lot of in between.
It seems like you seem to be a proponent of research, and that seems very likely to make people more positive, no? Maybe not.
Yeah. If well, not necessarily. Depends on what they find out. So, but I think that does relate to another question of sort of why they reject it. So suppose that you reject solar geoengineering because you think it's wrong to interfere in the climate system intentionally. You just think that that's wrong. You think that the climate system was created by God, and we have no rights to interfere in that. Of course, we are already interfering in that, but that was wrong, but that doesn't give us an excuse to intentionally do it. Someone who thinks that, they're not going to be persuaded by the evidence, whatever it is, I guess. Then, of course, we can have a debate, which goes back to Daniel's point. Like, is that reasonable? I don't think so, but don't tell anyone. But yeah. But the general, I do think it's an interesting point. Sort of general question, like what can we legitimately do to change people's opinions in order to make them reasonably accept something that they currently reject? And I think that. Yeah, there are some cases where it's clearly okay, others where it's not, but there's a interesting cases in between.
Okay, next is Tim. I saw you wave a finger around as well, but so maybe you could ask both questions.
Yeah, I don't think I had a follow-up. I just wanted to pick up on something that Kareem said actually earlier about how certain forms of mitigation might increase temperature in the short run. If you put that together with the assumption that mitigation's not going to do anything for the currently climate disadvantaged, and you're focusing only on the currently climate disadvantaged, so we're bracketing what happens to future generations for the purpose of global justice, you might be able to construct an argument similar to the one you considered for the conclusion that we have an obligation to stop mitigating. And that suggests that there's something wrong with the argument. Maybe it's the scope of global justice shouldn't be just about the currently disadvantaged, but it should also take future generations into account.
Yeah. But what if the conclusion is that is a reason not to stop emitting?
Yeah, so if you weaken it in the way that you suggested later on, with adding prima facie into the mix, then it seems less problematic.
Right.
So maybe you could add Kareem's point to your list of things that are wrong with the stronger argument. Although I would still be a little bit uncomfortable with the claim that there's a reason. Well, I don't, maybe not a reason, but prima facie obligation still seems a little.
Yeah, prima facie obligation maybe. Yeah, but I mean, there is a reason to continue emitting, namely that it's expensive to stop.
Sure.
But also, I want to say about that particular case that, as far as I understand, the reason why it would be harmful is that some emissions are sort of a form of geoengineering, right? So the maybe what we should infer from that is that we have to do some sort of solar geoengineering while we do these emission reductions to prevent these sort of short-term effects, because then we are sort of geoengineering, solar geoengineering, to offset the effects of reducing some certain types of emissions. Yeah.
Can I ask another question, or is it?
Can I follow up to this?
Yeah, just a short follow-up. I did some quick research here, so apparently there's a lot of disagreement on this. But if we would shut down all the carbon emissions,
right,
purely due to the sulfur effect, it would bump up temperatures with about 0.3 degrees Celsius.
Right.
And it might take up to 50 years before we get back to current temperatures.
Right.
So it's not only like a temporary
pain.
Right. It's a 1.5 generation.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So you could add another objection maybe to your list of worries about the initial argument.
Yeah.
Can give us a similar argument for the conclusion that we have this obligation of justice to stop mitigation, which sounds crazy.
Right.
Okay, there's one more person on the list, which is the person next to you, Tim. I don't know your name.
It's Casper.
Casper.
Thanks. So I was thinking about. So my question is similar to what I think Joe was talking about earlier. So a lot of the argument you are attributing to these people focuses on compensation, but I guess there's like another version of this argument that focuses on just reducing harm.
Yeah.
So you might say it's a obligation of global justice to reduce harm to the current generation, and then it seems that your main objection about whether the people accept compensation doesn't apply, because we are not talking about rectifying injustice. We are talking just about reducing harm. Right?
So I think, we actually discussed that in the paper, and I think there is that's to some extent correct, but I think that it's still a bit problematic, because then the argument would be if we're focusing on the current climate disadvantaged, then the argument would be not that we should solar geoengineer to rectify sort of past injustice we've inflicted on them, but we should do it in order to reduce the harm that they're currently experiencing, despite the fact that they don't accept, or that they reject it. So I think this sort of evidence about what they actually think about this is still going to be relevant. It's just going to be slightly differently relevant. So then the argument becomes problematically sort of paternalistic, rather than not being. So the argument that we presented, the problem with that, we think, is that we don't satisfy this duty that we have to rectify past injustice by doing something that the victim sort of doesn't consider, and reasonably so, as a compensation. But the problem with the sort of focusing on only reducing risk and harms would be that, if I'm supposed to do something for your sake, but you sort of explicitly don't want me to do it, then the problem will more be like sort of traditional paternalism, rather than the sort of problem that we focused on. And maybe that's that's a different problem, but still, part of what we're saying, I still think, carries over. In particular, that it is still important to know what they actually think of the. Unless maybe so. Of course, if we just are if you think of this in a purely utilitarian terms, it turns out that this reduces or increases their well-being more than other things that we can do, irrespective of what they think of it. Then, of course, that is a version of the argument that goes through without problem, assuming that we accept the empirical assumption. But assuming that we think that, when we do things for on other people's behalf, we should at least be conscious of what they think of the things that we're doing, then I think that some of these worries carry over. But yeah, you are right, though, that is a so importantly different argument.
Okay, we are now out of time, so let's thank Orri for this presentation.
Thank you.